Thank you. I want to call the meeting of the Water Rate Study Ad-Hoc Committee to order for March 19, 2012. And what I'd like to do right now is have a roll call of the members. Go ahead.
Let me get my quarterback.
Oh.
Caught me off guard.
You may have to turn the
On, press for 3 seconds, release. Where? Right here?
I guess so. That is.
And could you make sure that all of us are, oh, here. Test, test. Okay, great.
Sorry.
You on there?
No, I'm sorry.
All right, good. The first order of business is we just want to get a roll call, and are you going to do that?
Yes.
Okay, great, thanks.
Sorry. Jim Williams.
Here.
Jack Dean.
Here.
Greg Seaborn.
Here.
Sheridan George.
Here.
Don Ortega.
Here.
Pat McNally.
Here.
Ryan Alcantara.
Here.
Elaine Mitchell.
Here.
Jeff Otter.
Here.
John Avera.
Here.
Roland Chi. Aruni Thakur. Arlene Rocabato.
Here.
Leland Wilson.
Here. We have a quorum, which is a good thing. Thanks for everybody on the committee who came to the meeting. The first order of business, or third order of business, is on the consent calendar, basically the approval of the minutes of February 8, 2002 Ad-Hoc Committee meeting. Open the floor for correction, changes, or recommendation for approval.
Greg, hold that button down to the 3 minutes on the bottom. 3 seconds, I mean.
3 minutes?
Sorry about that.
See here a while.
Then it should, then the green light should come on. There you go.
Mr. Chairman, I make a motion, hello, that's loud. Make a motion to accept the minutes?
Do we have any more discussion?
Second.
Got a second? For a second, with that down there? Okay. All those in favor? Say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Hearing none, motion passed. The next item of business is an action item, that's the only action item on our committee's agenda for today. Before we begin, I just want to make a small statement and a briefing to bring the committee and any of our visitors up to study or up to speed on sort of where we are and just a historical timeline of the process. Back in 2010 in November, basically the city of Fullerton began a water rate study, and mainly to address infrastructure needs. In April of 2011, basically an ad hoc committee, this committee here, was formed to review the rate study at that time. In July 2011, the water rate study per se that was under consideration was put on hold because questions had come up during the committee to examine the water fund transfer to the general fund issue and how that would relate to our committee's business and the future recommendation for rate increases for infrastructure needs. From that point on, the city authorized a study to be done and made a contract to extend the study that had an undergoing with a company we will abbreviate as MFSG, which stands for, is someone from that? Municipal and Financial Services Group, and who had been the group that was doing the study before that. At that particular point, a study was then undertaken to look at various issues about the water fund to general fund transfer, and a final report on that study was then issued on March 12th. There were a couple other meetings that were held, but with the ad hoc committee, in between that time, some of them were just briefing meetings, and our last meeting was on the 12th, I believe, or the 8th of February. At this particular point, the committee basically is going to be looking over this particular study, getting a briefing from the people in MFSG to Ann City, what the results of that particular study were, and then this committee will then open up. We're going to open up the discussion to the members of this committee to ask questions and make comments, and then following those, we will be opening up the floor to the public to make comments. We would ask the public at that time to make comments only appropriate to the items that are on the agenda, and persons addressing the ad hoc committee will be given 3 minutes. There is a button or a light that's right in front of the microphone, and we would like to hold everybody to their good honor. At the time in which you see a yellow button, that will mean you have 30 seconds left to speak, and when the red button comes on, we would hope that you would close your comment. So at this particular time, I would like to open up the meeting with a member of MFSG by the name of Dave Hyder. And Dave, the meeting is yours now until such time as your presentation is done. Thank you, Dave.
Good evening, members of the Ad Hoc Committee. We do have a brief presentation tonight. So we're going to go over, can you hear me?
Turn it over, hold the button for 5 seconds. Or 5 minutes, whichever comes first.
Testing. Oh, there you go. Yeah. All right. Good evening. We do have a brief presentation. This is just going to highlight the detailed report that we've provided today. I'm going to go over, beginning with the background, in terms of why we're here tonight. As Patrick alluded to, the city's municipal code specifies a transfer from the water fund to the general fund as a payment in lieu of property taxes and franchise fee. This is an estimate of the in lieu of these charges, and the transfer is currently set at 10% of the annual water revenues. So in 2011, it was $2.5 million. With the passage of Proposition 218, enacted in 1996, there is a requirement for fees and charges not to exceed the cost of providing service. And at this point, I'm going to ask Kelly Salt from BVK to come up and talk a little bit about the history of 218.
Good evening. Just by way of background, Proposition 218, as David had said, was adopted in 1996. Amended the California Constitution to add Articles 13C and 13D. 13C pertained to the imposition of taxes, and 13D to the imposition of property-related fees and charges. Shortly after the adoption of Proposition 218, there was a challenge by the Apartment Owners Association of the City of Los Angeles versus the City of LA. In that case, the fees, the water service fees of the City of Los Angeles were in fact challenged as in violation of the proportionality requirements of Proposition 218. The court in that case determined that water service fees, in fact, are not subject to Proposition 218 because they were deemed to be commodity charges as opposed to property-related fees and charges. So that, after that case, most public agencies which imposed water service fees did not in fact deem their fees to be subject to provisions of 218. A couple of other cases several years down the road, Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association versus City of Fresno, and Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association versus City of Roseville similarly challenged the water service fees imposed by those agencies. And those two appellate courts had a different version of their view of Proposition 218 water service fees and charges. But the decision of the California Supreme Court basically settled the matter for those three appellate court decisions, which were competing with one another and gave different direction to public agencies. So in Bighorn Desert View Water Agency versus Virgil in 2006, the California Supreme Court finally determined that water service fees are in fact subject to Proposition 218. Therefore, any water service fees imposed by a public agency could not exceed the cost of providing the service.
Thank you, Kelly. So in light of Proposition 218, and as Kelly's explained it, MFSG was hired to examine the transfer, really study the transfer, with the key objective of identifying and quantifying the direct charges that should be assessed to the water fund for the use of city-owned property and facilities in support of the water system operations. So our overall approach was to review the property and the facilities used by the water fund, really looking at three main categories. The first was to identify city facilities that are used by the water fund, quantify what the cost the city incurs for the use of these facilities. Second was to identify the city property used by the water fund, and then quantify the costs associated with use of that property. And lastly was to identify the impact of the utilities on the city's street maintenance, and then quantify the cost due to the presence of utilities within the streets. So the presentation from this point forward will look at each of these three categories. First, focusing on the use of city facilities. So we did review the ownership status and the use of facilities currently used by the water department. Majority of the facilities were purchased by and accounted for in the water fund, but we did identify two city-owned facilities that have been and are continue to be used by the water department. They include City Hall at 2,000 square feet, housing the water department, and then in the city maintenance yard, there's about 5,000 square feet of the city maintenance yard that's used. The water fund is currently not charged for the use of this space in any way, and the city does own these facilities. So once we identified those two, we looked at what should the water fund be charged for the use of these facilities. And first we looked at obviously the occupied space, and the standard way to charge for the use of space is a rental payment. So for Class B office space is what City Hall would be characterized as. It's $1.75 per square foot, so that turns into $3,500 per month, or an annual charge of about $42,000 for the use of space in City Hall by the water department. Maintenance yard, that would be industrial space, so that's 60 cents. Bigger space, but $3,000 per month, $36,000 per year for the use of the space at the maintenance yard. So those are direct costs that the city is currently incurring on behalf of the water department. Once we looked at the facility, we moved on to looking at the properties. As you can imagine, the water system utilizes a significant amount of property within the city. As it supports storage reservoirs and wells, these are really significantly sized facilities. So we looked at the ownership status of the 13 properties supporting the reservoirs and the wells within the city. And the city actually contracted out through a competitive bid process and had an independent appraisal report completed by Stephen White for these properties in order to come up with a market value of what these properties are worth, as well as an annual rental payment for the use of these properties. So here's what the properties look like in terms of the listing. You can see the property address. There's, again, 13 properties that house reservoirs and wells. You can see the size, and then the determined ownership status. So it was determined that 4 of these properties were purchased by the water fund, but the remaining 9 properties were purchased by the general fund and therefore owned by the city. So we then zeroed in and had the independent appraiser look at those that are owned by the city. And here's the 9 properties that are owned by the city. looking at the market value of these properties, and then the market rent per acre for each of these properties, and then the annual rental payment for the use of these properties would be $1.37 million. The appraisal was completed in February 20th of this year. And so the total rental payment there would be $1.37 million per year for the use of these city-owned properties. An important distinction here is that the reason that it's treated this way is that the water department is operated as an enterprise fund. It's set up like a separate business. So if the city were to sell these properties to a Golden State Water or a private utility, a similar manner would be used to sell the properties. So we do want to treat the water fund as it is an enterprise fund, and therefore this is a valid analysis to use this approach. So the last section of our study was to look at what's the impact of the utilities on the city streets. In particular, what's the impact of the wet utilities, which would include water, sewer, and storm drain pipes that are underneath the city streets. And there's all kinds of evidence that shows that the presence of these utilities reduce the life cycle and the performance of streets for a number of reasons. One is just that you have uneven utility settling due to utility trenching. So there is a figure here down at the bottom, the cross section. You can see when you do a utility trench, you do backfilling, and as a result, over time, you do have uneven settling underneath the pavement, which causes the pavement to have a reduced life. You also have utility cuts when you have to get into repair lines, and just the presence of having flowing water underneath these streets when you have leaks and things like that. There's a lot of evidence that significantly reduces and results in increased maintenance. So as a result, the city does incur significant costs related to street maintenance due to the presence of these wet utilities. So right now, the city maintains 291 centerline miles of pavements. That includes 66 miles of arterial highways and 224 miles of local streets. The city's plan is within their maintenance division to continually improve the condition of the streets, and they do evaluate the streets pavements using a pavement condition index, PCI scoring index. As we mentioned in the report, the streets are currently rated as fair, and in order to keep them at fair, there's going to need to be significant increased spending. So the result of increased maintenance due to the wet utilities is inherent there. In addition to just ongoing maintenance of the streets, the city does contract out capital projects, which consist of resurfacing the streets, and those totaled $5.6 million in fiscal year 10-11. Now, the completion of street resurfacing capital projects does require the adjustments of manholes and valve covers to bring them up to grade level. So we want to look at what's the cost, when you resurface a street, what's the cost of having the utilities there. Based upon a review of the historical street resurfacing capital projects, on average about 3.17% of the total cost of the projects were due to adjusting manhole covers and valve covers, manholes. So as a result, it is assumed that 3.17% of the cost of resurfacing projects going forward would be attributed to wet utilities. When we do the allocation, I'll bring that back to your attention. So in terms of the total street pavement maintenance that's completed, there's really 4 categories. There's asphalt digouts, crack sealing, asphalt paving, asphalt skin, and patch repair. We looked at 3 years, showing 2 here of the last 3 years. You can see the total expenditures related to these categories of street pavement maintenance total about $590,000 per year. And I do want to mention down below that there are 2 really, when the city goes out right now, there's a water line breaks, and they cut into the street and they do maintenance to the line, and then as a result have to do maintenance to the street. Those costs are captured currently and they're charged directly to the water fund, but only for the materials. The labor and equipment are not currently charged to the water fund. Those stay in the general fund. So that $63,000 is currently charged to the water fund, so that would come out of the $586,000. But the additional, and there's an extra 4 there, I see now, the $49,000 is not currently charged to the water fund. So when you take out those direct charges, the resulting street maintenance service costs, $474,000 in 2010-11. So that would be separate from direct costs, just ongoing maintenance of the streets. So our next step is to take those costs and allocate them to the utilities. And so we bring over the 474, assuming that 33% of that is due to the utility trenching, so $156,000 of the remaining not direct charge surface work would be charged due to utilities. And as I mentioned, there's about $5.6 million worth of capital projects that were completed in 2010-11. Again, the 3.17 being for valve cover adjustment and manhole adjustment results in $177,000. So when you total those up, the total street impacts due to wet utilities would be $333,000 in fiscal year 10-11. So that would be excluding the direct charges to water.
I'm sorry, by wet utilities you mean water and sewer?
And storm drain.
Storm.
Yep, those three. So as I just mentioned, there are three wet utilities. There's water mains, sewer mains, and storm drain mains. And in order to allocate those costs, we needed to look at how much pipe there is within each of those varied asset types. So we did that by getting the total amount of mains that are under streets that are related to water, the total amount that are related to sewer, and the total amount that are related to storm drain. You can see about 52% of the total lines are water lines, 40% sewer, and then about 8% would be storm drain. So then we use those costs to allocate the utility impacts to the various utilities. So let me step you through here. For fiscal year 10-11, we have the $333,000 that was identified as wet utility impacts. We allocate 52% of that, or a little over 51%, to water. So you can see the $172,000 to water. And we have those additional labor and equipment for direct charges that are currently not charged to water, bringing it to a total of $222,000 for water street impacts. And the allocation of that $333,000 to the sewer, based upon the amount of sewer lines, 40%, and then the allocation to the storm drains, getting to $25,000 for storm drains. So with that, that's the three categories of areas that we looked into. We'll move on into our recommendations. And our key recommendations are is that the water fund should not be charged to transfer the general fund equal to 10% of the annual revenues within the water fund. But instead, direct charges should be imposed to the water fund, sewer, and sanitation fund. And sanitation fund has storm drains within it. And it should include the costs associated with city facilities, city property, and the impacts of wet utilities on city streets. So those three areas that we looked at. Specifically, what this would look like, and this is just 1 year, fiscal year 2010-11, for the water fund. The direct charges for the use of City Hall, $42,000. The direct charges for the maintenance yard use, $36,000. The direct charge for the use of city-owned properties that house reservoirs and wells would be almost $1.4 million. And then the impacts due to wet utilities allocation to water would be $222,000. Bringing the total annual charges to the water fund in this particular year of $1.67 million. We need to emphasize that we would strongly encourage the city as it goes forward to review these direct charges on an annual basis to ensure that they continue to be appropriate and accurate. Similarly, for sewer and sanitation, all we have here is the street impacts. So the allocation, there should be a direct charge to the sewer fund of $134,000 for this particular year, and $25,000, almost $26,000 to the storm drain. And again, these should be reviewed on an annual basis. And that concludes this portion. I turn it back over to Patrick.
Thank you, David. Oops. Thanks, David. At this point, we want to go ahead and finish the presentation? And or do we want to address some questions if there are from any from the committee directly to Mr. Hyder?
Dave Schickling, Water System Manager. Chairman McNelly, we set up the presentation to pause at this point and let you guys discuss the study that you've just seen reviewed. After that, if there's time, and if you guys would like to do it, we can go into possible reimbursement options. So that's kind of the way we set it up, if that's okay.
Yeah, I agree. Is there any objection to the committee members at this point to take that pause and move forward with the questions for the committee? Okay, hearing none. I'd like to open the discussion at this point now to the members of the committee. If they have any questions they'd like to address to Mr. Hyder or to staff or any other things that they might have come up in reading the information that we were just given a few days ago, actually. I believe we got the packages on Monday or Tuesday? Was it Tuesday? Thursday. Okay. Or last Thursday. Yeah, correct. So we've had them about 3 or 4 days to hopefully everybody's had a chance to read them. So I'm going to go ahead and open the floor to members of the committee to comments or questions they might have or been chomping in the bit to add into the method. What I'd like to do is start with Jack, and then we'll move over here to Sheridan, and we'll move forward as we see answers.
Mr. Chair, I don't think I want to make a formal motion, but I would like to suggest that we plan not to take any action today on this. I'm very concerned that a study that took 7 months and cost approximately $100,000 and also had the consultation of Best and Krieger law firm and also as much time as necessary from city staff put into it. Concerned that we have only had 4 days to digest it over a weekend. And I also have been in communication with Tim Biddle, who's legal director of Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association. And unfortunately, he's been down with the flu over the weekend and is really probably not going to get to this until later this week. So all things considered, I don't think that there's any way that we can evaluate this and take any action today. I think perhaps questions and answers would be good so that perhaps we have more information. I would also like to suggest that perhaps some mechanism be set up, perhaps by email with some people involved in the study that they could be contacted during the next week or two before our next meeting, which I would recommend we have in about 2 weeks, to ask questions as they come up, so the committee members would be able to actually sort of do this in an ongoing fashion and not have to save them up and have them answered in some kind of a meeting again. By the next meeting, hopefully we would all have enough information that we could make an informed decision of some kind on this. Thank you.
Thanks for your input, Jack. Sheridan?
Yes. Out of the this 10% transfer, this $2.5 million that has been ongoing, does the sewer and the storm drain have the similar type thing, or is just the water fund paying all of this stuff?
The sewer fund nor the sanitation fund has a in lieu of transfer to the general fund.
Okay. All right. That answers my question, because it looks like there's $800,000 difference right now that from what the water fund has been paying and what actually it should be paying, and the other ones are not doing anything. So, okay, that was my question.
I believe your analysis is pretty good. Adam?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With respect to the street maintenance, I was wondering whether any of the studies that are frequently conducted by organizations like the American Society of Civil Engineers and others were studied where, or evaluated in order to make these calculations, where they've calculated that the #1 cause of street problems is bad maintenance, bad slurry programs that many cities have, and also issues with backfill. There's a practice that they call a one-sack backfill, where cement is mixed with gravel in order to prevent settling. And different cities have different qualities in their street maintenance program. The #2 cause of wear and tear on streets is trash trucks. And I'm wondering if, as a utility, those utilities which are contracted are also creating some kind of compensation for the city for the wear and tear that occur, as a way of calculating that into the potential impact of water lines.
Mr. Chairman, can I just, I don't know, dovetail on Don's point, that would probably apply to the cable companies and or gas companies also. Their infrastructure is also buried in the streets at some places, I'm sure. So.
Yeah, in terms of cable companies and trash, you do have a private hauler within the city, and they all do pay a franchise fee, which does compensate the city for the wear and tear on the streets. In general, the studies have shown, though, that white utilities have a much more significant impact due to the fact that it's much easier to get to a cable line because it's done in conduit. You don't need to do the significant street cuts and things of that sort, as well as just the flowing water. The flow of water and the leaks that occur destabilizes the trenching that's already unstable and causes for wear and tear. I would absolutely agree that American Society of Civil Engineers would say that underfunding of streets is a significant problem. But you could argue that the beginning of that problem is the fact that when you look at having a wet utility underneath the street, there's been very detailed studies that have shown that it reduces the life cycle of the street by about 35%. So you could say that the presence of the street, on top of the fact that if you're not spending enough of maintenance, would have a compounding effect. I don't know that you can look at the two separate of each other.
Is there a consistent formula in which these calculations fall, so that you're extrapolating what the impact is based upon some formula that can be applied across the board?
There seems to be I wouldn't say there's an exact formula. There's a range of estimates in terms of the costs associated with it, and as the city now will be required to, with a direct charge, track those costs more specifically. But there's a significant amount of evidence that demonstrates that it does have a significant impact in the range of 35 to 40%.
Mr. Seaborn and then Mr. Vera.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Over the weekend I had the opportunity to ask several civil engineers what they thought about the idea of trench settlement. And all of them said the same thing, that if the trench begins to settle below the surface of the street, that it wasn't packed correctly with the right materials. That if it's done correctly, it really doesn't settle, that it maintains its shape and its form. And I got to say, looking at some of the work done by some of our contractors throughout the city, and looking at the way they've done it versus the way our own crews do it, I see a big difference in the technique that is visible on the surface. I have work that was done on my street at virtually the same time that work was done 2 blocks over by a contractor, also for water. And the work on my street has sunk significantly. The settling is very noticeable, to the point where it's probably a trip hazard if anybody tries to walk in that area. But you go down a block where the contractor did it, and it's totally nice. I mean, it's the one part of the road that's smooth, which is sad for our city. Which brings me to the next question. It looks like, based on what I'm reading up here, that we're being told that we need to pay twice for that section of asphalt. We pay for it once when we trench and we fix the pipe and we put asphalt on top of it. Then we have to pay again through the what would actually be a replacement of this in lieu franchise fee to cover the costs of repairing that. That seems like we're getting double taxed. And so I really want to argue the merits of whether or not that's legitimate, whether or not we are we should be paying twice for something that we have already done. When it's done right the first time, you shouldn't have any issues the second time around. Also, what do we base the idea that rent is somehow a cost, and therefore that there's property that's owned by the city that the city needs to rent to itself, and somehow there's a cost associated with that? It looks like it was really a search for justification and not an actual cost. I mean, cost is a second utility company, electric company, charging us electricity for our wells, for our pumps. That is a direct cost. Fabricating a rental scheme that does not currently exist and saying that there's somehow a lost cost in there we're not recovering seems completely fabricated, and I really don't have a lot of, it just doesn't have a lot of credibility. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Seymour. Mr. Rivera.
Yeah, I have a question about repairs. When the water lines break and your city comes out and repairs them, your workers, do they follow the engineering instructions on repairs and things like that? Because I've experienced in my whole neighborhood exactly what he's talking about, where the repairs, they've sunk. And I've been in the maintenance business for 40 years, and when you slur, you don't have that issue. And then I've noticed the other thing that I think raises the cost is when they do it, they cold patch it, then they come back out 3 or 4 days, tear the cold patch out and put the hot patch in. Well, in the meantime, the cold patch sinks. So I'm just questioning if they're using the proper technique.
Mr. Hoppy, could you address that question?
I'll give it a shot. Good evening, Don Hoppy. I'm the Director of Engineering. What happens when the...
Is your mic on, Don?
I got to lean down, sorry.
Or grab it.
Be shorter. What happens when the water maintenance guys are out there doing repairs is because there's a water line leak. All of the surrounding subgrade is completely saturated. When they backfill it, unfortunately, they'll often use the material that's available, and it's cold mixed because they don't break at convenient times. It's almost impossible to logistically provide hot mix on an as-needed basis when you're doing repairs, emergency repairs. They put the cold mix down so they can reopen the street so that the motorists can drive and utilize the right-of-way, and they come back as soon as they can schedule when they have hot mix. I mean, it'd be nice to have a better way to do it, but they don't break conveniently, as you well know. So there's a significant difference between that type of repair and actually doing street repair work. When it's a long, hot, pre-programmed, pre-bid, asphalt ready to go, paving machines ready to go. It really is significantly different.
Thank you.
Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to get back to Committee Member Seaborn's statement or question. Was anybody from staff going to address the issue? Because I mean, as a real estate guy, you're wondering the same thing with regards to the cost of the leasing?
The concept is the general fund pays for the property or the facilities, for example, City Hall. There's funds expended by the general fund. An enterprise fund is supposed to be a solely sufficient, economically self-sufficient entity. If water utility were not using that City Hall space, it would have to go out and purchase or rent space from another location. So to the extent that it is utilizing space that has been purchased by the general fund should be reimbursed for that cost. There's ongoing maintenance about those facilities. There are costs in terms of purchasing or constructing facilities, and the water fund should pay something to the general fund for the support the general fund provides for the water utility in that regard. That's the concept.
Sure.
And basically, under the concept of the two cases that were decided in Howard Jarvis versus City of Roseville, as well as Howard Jarvis versus City of Fresno, both of those cases, the court said that you can charge, in fact, for use of general fund properties. So to the extent that the city is going to be reimbursed, or the water utility is going to pay rent to the general fund, for the use of city properties, it is an appropriate direct cost which you should pay the general fund for. Otherwise, we'd have to incur that cost on its own.
I was wondering, are there any economies of scale that were missed? If we were paying a separate water utility for their facilities, that water utility might hypothetically be serving different multiple cities out of one building, and therefore you would get economies of scale. Is that a factor that's been considered in there? Is that a realistic factor?
Well, in terms of the appraisal or calculation of spend for various properties, it is basically done from appraisal format based upon highest and best use. City Hall based upon Class B property and evaluating what would be an appropriate rental for such property. So there wasn't an evaluation of how many ratepayers there are that can pay the rent. It's just based upon what would be the normal cost you provide for rental property.
Mr. Ortega, you have your hand up on that. I noticed you want to step in.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes. On that same line of questioning, the office structures, maintenance yards, where there's it's not a dedicated facility to water, I buy your argument. However, in those instances where the dedicated use of a property is to water, like if you have a reservoir on a property, it seems to me that the rationale is similar to charging rent for the use of the pipes, for example, because you could hypothetically argue that instead of putting water in it, you put oil in it, and so there could be a higher and best use that would be more expensive, and then you charge that to the water fund because there'd be an opportunity cost loss. But let's go with the assumption that you've made. The industry utility standard for charging rent, for example, on a well, would calculate an area around the well that's approximately 30 by about 100 feet. So going with Mr. Wilson's question, has any effort been made to calculate, for example, the number of wells on a property? You calculate, the industry standard for the space that needs to be segregated for that well, and then you calculate the rent back based on that calculation. Or is the rent for the whole lot? In which case I would have a big question, because if there's a higher and best use for that lot and it's not being applied, and the water fund is being charged for the entire amount, then that's unfair to the ratepayers because they paid for it already. So I'm interested in what calculations went into assessing the charge for some of these general fund properties that have wells. And then my final question, and perhaps the attorney can answer it on this front, is, okay, so the water fund is an enterprise fund. It is separately governed by a board. I understand that that board is the city council. So I'd like to know if you could make available to us the minutes of any meetings where the water fund was discussed, where detailed financial reports were presented so that the water fund could protect itself from unwarranted charges and taxes. If you can answer those questions, I'd appreciate it. Or charges by the city. Who protects the water fund, I'm asking?
The city council is responsible. It is the governing entity of the city of Fullerton. Consequently, the water department is merely a department of the city of Fullerton. It is a separate enterprise from a legal context, and it's supposed to be fully self-sufficient. But the city council does act as a governing board for all departments within the city under the supervision of the city manager.
Do we have minutes of meetings where the city council considered detailed financial reports about the water fund?
Anytime the city council holds a public meeting, it is going to have minutes of those meetings reported. Pursuant to Brown Act.
So you're telling us that there have been meetings where the water, and it's kind of like when the community redevelopment fund, you have a meeting of the redevelopment board, the city council acts in that capacity, that meeting is adjourned, and then the city council meeting begins. You're telling me that there's been instances when that's happened with the enterprise fund for water, where the council has convened, they've said, okay, let's evaluate these detailed P&L statements, and
No, that's different, because the redevelopment agency is a separate legal entity. The water department is merely a department of the city of Fullerton.
No, but I'm talking about the enterprise fund. You just told us that the enterprise fund was a separate legal entity.
It's not a separate legal entity. For purposes of determining how you evaluate the use of monies, is to refer to as an enterprise fund department. And as an enterprise fund department, it has to be fully self-sufficient. It doesn't rely upon general fund monies unless the general fund chooses to use monies for that purpose. It's simply a matter of legalities in terms of how you classify the fund itself. It's merely a department of the city of Fullerton.
Excuse me. I think your hand went up first, Mr. Seaborn, and then we'll come back to you, Mr. George.
Just a quick question. How many enterprise funds does the city of Fullerton operate? Anybody tell me? And obvious follow-up to that is how many of those are paying rent?
You have the sanitation fund, which brings in revenue. The sewer fund is established as an enterprise, along with the water. Would you consider the airport, Don, an enterprise fund? The airport, they do, the airport does pay a fee back to the general fund.
Are they paying rent, and is their fee that they're being assessed, is it more like the in lieu franchise fee, or is it an actually directly assessed cost, if you will?
Yeah, we could charge them.
Yeah, Mr. Seymour, I don't know the details of that payment of their budget. We could get you that answer. A redevelopment agency was paying rent on the third floor before they were dissolved.
So we're looking to make up rent? We're shifting the cost around?
Mr. George?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is sort of looking at the other side of the coin. It's more a comment than anything else. I don't really expect an answer. But it would seem to me that the fund is being in effect hired by the city to supply a service to the citizens, and perhaps the city should be paying the fund to do the job.
I concur.
I don't expect, I just throwing out the idea.
Mr. Chairman, if I could, we do have a member of the Infrastructure Review Committee who's not part of the Ad-Hoc, and as such, he's not a voting member, but I thought it'd be a good opportunity if he has any input. Mr. Smith?
Do you have 20 minutes?
No. Gotta be reasonable.
Yeah, could you introduce yourself?
My name's Wesley Smith. I've been recently appointed to the Infrastructure Review Committee. I am a licensed electrical engineer with the state of California. And I've reviewed the papers and the information provided on the website. I'm kind of shocked. What this is basically a desperate effort by the city to maintain this fund, the amount of money that they're getting from this water fund and the transfer. And it appears like they're working very diligently to come up with a cost that they can bill to the water fund to make it as high as possible to maintain this revenue stream. My number one concern is that if the city fails to maintain the water piping, the amount of money that comes from the water fund to the general fund increases. Because they have to now have all these repairs. They have no reason to repair the pipes, because the more they degrade, the more money the water fund is going to be transferring to the general fund. When they come to us next month and ask us for a water rate increase, whatever percentage we end up with, they get 6.7 or 10% of that. And it's almost like an unvoted on tax increase. They get to sell this water rate increase because our infrastructure is solely degraded. My number one question is, how much money has been spent in the last 5 years on maintaining our water system? Maybe $100,000, if that. We're talking about a minimum of about $100 to $200 a foot. Multiply that times 240 miles. And then you're going to get a cost a relative cost of what this is going to cost to repair. And I don't even want to talk about sewer and storm drain. Are those even being maintained? But let's stay on the water here. It seems like they're trying to maximize the amount, they're scrambling to make an excuse for the maximum amount of money that they can get and maintain from this water fund. This water fund and this rent is if this was an outside agency. It's the right-hand selling to the left. The water fund has more than, over the last 40 years, paid for these facilities.
Mr. Chair,
overcharged.
If I may, Harold Potter, Dick Jones' office, City Attorney's Office. I believe Mr. Smith's comments are now getting into public comment rather than your questioning and answer. So if we could allow him his 3 minutes in public comment, I think that would be appropriate.
It might be appropriate, Mr. Weissmuth?
Wes Smith.
Well, Weissmuth. In that regard, not being a direct member of the committee, but being a member of the infrastructure committee, we welcome your comments. Look forward to sitting down and talking with you, as I also serve on the infrastructure committee, and hearing more of your opinions on that regard. But it does appear that your 3 minutes are up as a member of the public.
Thank you.
Yes.
Is a point in continuing the line of thinking that Mr. Smith was presenting. There's an interesting quote on page 2 of this report that says, as part of the rate study, the last 3 years of operating expenditures and revenues were reviewed, and it was determined that the water fund has been able to fully fund the transfer to the general fund at the level stated in the city's municipal code, 10% of revenues. And so my question is, if we were able to fund that, then why weren't we able to, wouldn't the replacement of pipes at a rate of, 6 miles per year be included in the maintenance costs? And perhaps it would have been the reverse that would have been stated in the statement that, because of our maintenance schedule that requires X number of miles of pipes to be replaced per year, the 10% couldn't be funded. I don't know. I mean, to me, it just doesn't make sense that we would have money to put into the general fund, but not have money to replace more than a mile of pipeline a year. So I think that's kind of what I took out of your statements. It reminded me of this passage.
Okay, Mr. Dean.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I appreciate Mr. Smith's enthusiasm as a new member. I think that there may be, and I want to clarify this for myself too, perhaps he had misunderstood the approach that's being taken here. The methodology is to eliminate the percentage add-on approach. Am I correct? In other words, in the future, added costs of any kind will be charged at cost. There will be no inflating factor on a 10% add-on, which is what has been going on. So, is that correct?
Some of the rent is going to be increasing at a rate of up to 10%.
Oh, okay, but that's specified for those specific rents. So in other words, but there's no overall. If we increase the rate to the water users, it's not going to automatically be inflated by 6.7%, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Mr. Rivera.
Yeah, since we're talking about the rate, I'd like to know how the city determines per square footage the cost. The reason I asked that is I just leased a building, and it was a whole lot less than that. So I'd just like to know how they determine that cost.
Well, it was done by the appraiser, looking at the property, the value of the property, the location of the property, some comparable Class B office space for the city hall, in proximity to downtown, in the same area, and then also looking at comparable properties for industrial space. Based upon the market, assumed market value of comparable properties, and
I see.
provide that detail.
Okay.
We're on the action item. Mr. Thakur is a member who came in a little bit late, and I know you had some comments that you wanted to make as well, so I'm going to go ahead and turn the mic over to you.
Good evening. I apologize, I was in court and near LAX, and I had to get back to Fullerton for this meeting. And I did have an opportunity to review the information provided by the city, and just speaking very generally as a member of the public before I had all of this information, when I was presented with what seemed like the option of repairing our aging water infrastructure and not doing so, and the problems that that would bear, I think I a little bit naively just assumed that we need to fix this problem. And if it takes our community coming together and each of us throwing in our share in terms of our fees, then that was the right thing to do. But as a member of this committee and representing not just myself, but my family, my neighbors, my friends, my community, I think I've begun to see that this is a much more complex and murky issue. And I'm so grateful to everybody here that's been giving their time and trying to get to the bottom of this issue so we as a community can solve this problem. And I recently put my name on something that our mayor had distributed, and I just wanted to share that with you if you didn't receive it. And specifically, the Ad Hoc Committee and the issue of water was raised by Mayor Sharon Quirk Silva, who wanted to also get to the bottom of this issue so that the council can make an informed decision. And it's our duty here to really give feedback to members of the council who have the ultimate vote on these issues. And I'll just read important parts here. This is from the mayor, who I think it's important to note now has our ear, and I think that we should have hers. She says she feels it is important that despite the anticipation of an audit of water fund transfers to the general fund, the report by the Municipal and Finances Services Group is not an audit, but a study of data provided by the city. A formal audit requires a CPA, a certified public accountant, and it is important that we, the Ad Hoc Committee, members and public understand that this study that we all received and which we're talking about tonight does not meet the rigors of a formal audit. And so I would like to make a motion at the appropriate time that the city do an appropriate full audit of the questions that we've raised, and that a CPA firm be found to prepare that document as recommended by Mayor Quirk Silva. She further states, finally, enterprise funds such as our water fund are typically governed by a fund board. Such boards review detailed financial statements related to the water utility. The MFSG, which again stands for Municipal and Finances Services Group, the study, MSFG study, makes no reference to this board, which she sees as a significant shortcoming in the area of transparency and accountability. And she urges us, the Ad Hoc Committee, to advise the City Council about steps that ought to be taken to increase transparency and accountability so that transfers from the water fund to the general fund are technically, legally, and ethically done. So a second motion that I'd like to make at an appropriate time, and actually perhaps Dave has this information, but our fund board, we don't know, we haven't heard anything about it. I didn't realize that this was a necessary step, and I'd like to know more about that fund board and who the members are and why we haven't heard anything from them to this point. And at this point, I'll leave it at that.
Just to reiterate what Kelly mentioned earlier, the fund board is the city council. It is a department of the city, it's an enterprise fund, but they serve as the board. So there is no separate, it's not a utility authority per se, it's an enterprise fund department of the city.
So whenever the city council is meeting to discuss
Correct.
an infrastructure issue such as this, they're meeting as the fund board?
Correct.
As a city council.
As the city council, but they are the board.
Any other members like to continue to make comments? Go ahead.
I'd just like to echo the recommendation for a formal audit. I think we've raised some good questions in terms of the nature of the study. It's very helpful, gives us a good context, but an independent study would go to the heart of some of the other issues that have been raised. But I do want to to ask just for some clarification in terms of practices with enterprise fund departments in other municipalities. Is it a common practice to do the rent back? I mean, I've heard it in different types of settings, and it seems like that's one of the concerns that folks have. But that kind of comparisons of best practices might be helpful for the committee to consider.
I'll try to answer your question. Generally, in Orange County cities that have a water utility, they charge a franchise fee. There's a flat percentage, just as the city of Fullerton is proposing to get rid of it. That's the typical practice.
And I might mention real quickly that in this regard, although some people might say we're a little bit late at getting in the game, but asking this committee particularly to move forward in the way that it has is fairly proactive relating to the other cities throughout Orange County in terms of asking these kinds of questions that we've been asking. And so in that respect, we can, again, without going back and fixing the blame about how we got here, as chair, I can attest that the diligence that this committee has had regarding this issue is to be commended. The response we've gotten from staff thus far, and some discussions we've had with council, is also to be commended regarding how citizen activity and citizen action, because we're citizens here. We're certainly appointed, and each one of us comes to this from some degree of expertise, and it is also to be commended in that regard. And so I'd like to make sure that both the members of the audience and the members of the committee are aware that this is a positive step that the city is taking through its citizens to bring these issues to fore. What the future holds is still up in the air. This committee has no authority to make decisions. Our committee is basically here to make recommendations, and regardless of what those are, we'll have to see exactly what the council does based upon the recommendations of this committee or not. In adding a couple other comments to Mr. Thakur's statement, it might be bold to say that with the uncertainty right now of the 10% flat rate and the uncertainty of getting a good solid number from which the city can determine or evaluate either, number one, the continuation of some fee payback schedule according to historical enterprise fund repayments from the fund to the city, and it might just be something to bring up, that that particular fund be suspended until such time as we can get a better handle on the exact numbers, that number one, the philosophy and the politics behind the issue itself, and number two, real good, accurate numbers that we can all hear as not only members of this committee, but as the citizens of Fullerton can, and I'm not running for office, by the way, can have a real good assessment of that. Now, and it's a bold statement to make, to maybe suspend that at this point and make a recommendation to council to do so, but I would be willing to favor such a motion. Mr. George.
Thank you. I have a question. Does Proposition 218 mandate that the city or the fund pay the city a rent? I'm of the opinion that the city is around to provide certain services to its citizens. Part of it is going to be water, sewer, roads, and all that sort of thing. And that this rent, if you please, that's just almost like double taxation, as we've heard before, right? to me, I don't think it should even be there unless we're required now to do it.
The concept is essentially that under Proposition 218, you can't charge more than the cost of providing service. Now, the cost of providing service includes all the costs associated with providing that service. If the water fund had not been occupying the city hall space, it would have to occupy that space elsewhere, either purchase the land or rent it from somebody else. Now, in terms of the double counting, if you think about it as a taxpayer, only property owners are paying taxes which basically support the general fund. And those taxes have to pay for all the city services, your police, your fire, all the other services. So to the extent that you have non-property owners who are getting the benefit of that as water rate payers, should they not be refunding or paying costs to the general fund for the support that the general fund provides to the water utility? That is the concept, because this cost of providing service wholeheartedly, the whole kit and caboodle, everything that the water fund has to do in order to provide that service to water rate payers.
Okay, I understand the concept, but still at the same time, the city is, supplying these things, and that should be part of its cost of doing business as a city. I still hold that, as far as I'm concerned, the $2.5 million that the fund has been paying to the city should be stay with the fund and use that to start replacing pipes.
Thank you, Mr. Jordan. I think, Mr. Williams, you had your arm up.
Chair,
and then
I think I can be heard. Set her up for me, Jack. Part of this is almost philosophical. What do we want to do? And it flows both ways, and the comments that were just made were more akin to my thinking. If the issue is the calculations and the considerations that are given in allocating the expense, I think it's fair to say that you really don't want general fund monies subsidizing water, because you want the water rates to be equitable and fair and attributable to the actual expense that's made, and vice versa. You don't want the water fund subsidizing city programs that are not related, because that's not a fair and equitable way to charge ratepayers. So in general, and I don't know that there's not consensus for this, but I do like the idea, if it's reasonably not too expensive to make these determinations as to what the appropriate expenses are to share resources that are otherwise involved in other activities for the city. Whether or not the rental, and I'm a property owner, whether or not the rental numbers used stand up in terms of real market value and so forth, that can be determined. But I do like the approach that the report is taking, and I think actually consistent with what our chair McNeely has said, I do commend the committee, because we started out trying to figure out how we were going to replace critical infrastructure with likely a rate increase, and now we're talking about revising how we approach these ways of doing things. So I'm very pleased about that. But I also want to remind everyone of the critical expectation of all of our citizens, residents, the ratepayers, the businesses, the restaurants, that when they turn the tap on, they're expecting reliable, adequate supply of clean, safe drinking water. And so at no time do I want to take away from the resources necessary to assure that, because that is, number one, a fiduciary and almost a moral obligation of the city. But in general, I really like what's happened in this committee in the last year almost that I think we've been working on this. And I do like the approach of doing a specific allocation and calculation. And then let me just close by saying I think this report costs $100,000 about. I did my homework.
A good number on that?
$60,000, and that includes the attorneys, that includes the appraisal, and Dave. So that's all.
And that's specifically the water,
That's
the
the
transfer
study
study?
that you have. Yeah.
Okay, and the other rate study, Dave?
No, that's different. This study, the transfer to the general fund from the water fund specifically, and that includes BB&K's cost. Kelly is an employee of them, and Stephen White, the appraisal, and Dave Hyder of MSF.
Jim, are you okay with those numbers?
Yes, and just to wrap up, I apologize, by the way, on the generalization there. But as I did my homework, I think we have a 5-year period of time when we make some adjustments. And I think every 10 years we do a more thorough investigation. But I really think in general the direction we're going is a very good direction and fair to the ratepayers. And again, I think our greatest responsibility as citizens and our elected public officials is to be sure that the citizens can and ratepayers can count on their water.
I might want to add really quickly as a comment that we don't want to forget one of the original purposes of why we were formed, not only to look at a rate study specifically, but to look at a rate study that was specific to an infrastructure need, which is very important for this community. Dave, Mr. Schickling?
Yeah, on that point, we're going to show you a graphic here. It'll come up in a second. You know, as you said, Pat, we originally started with the water rate study. It went into this look at the transfer, which was a good concept. If you remember on the top bar there, we had 5 years of 6%. If we used the 1.7 million instead of the 2.5, and we went back 3 years as a reimbursement and applied that, that's what you'd see for the rate increase. And it's an estimate, of course, but that's what you'd see going ahead. If you remember going back to that rate increase, that gets us 6 miles a year, that gets us our infrastructure that we're looking to get, and that's the impact now. You go from a 6% increase to 2.5s in the first 3, and then 5.25 in the last 2. So I think that, for this committee, that's a great thing to get to that level, because that is, no increase is good. But we have infrastructure needs, and this is a very good start to getting those taken care of.
Just Mr. Seaborn, and then we'll go back here to Mr. Carroll.
You know, back on May 23rd of 2011, I brought up the franchise fee as did a couple other members. And, you know, my thought was if we got rid of the franchise fee, we wouldn't have to have any rate increases for at least a few years. And the more we look at this, the more that's starting to bear true, that without a franchise fee, we don't have to have a rate increase. We can invest in our infrastructure without really further burdening the people who have been paying for the last 40 plus years since this franchise fee has been in place. In that time, with $27 million being essentially skimmed and used for the general fund and going towards whatever the general fund goes for, which is mostly labor and salaries and benefits and that sort of thing. The water department has been here for as long as the city's been here. And the city has, it's always been one and the same. It's the same agency. And when I first started reading this, when I heard the thoughts about maybe a rent back or something like that, just instantly it felt wrong. It just feels unethical. It may be perfectly legal with Prop 218, and I'm not going to argue the legality of that. I'm not an attorney. I'll let them hash it out. But it just sounds wrong on numerous levels. And I kind of compare it to Wall Street. There's a lot of things that Wall Street did wrong. They may not have been illegal, but we can look at it in hindsight and say it was clearly unethical, and they clearly should not have been doing that. And from that, there's been new laws created, there's been new oversight, and maybe some good will come from that. I'll probably just find another loophole. So here we are, about a year later, and we went from a 10% franchise fee down to about 6 1/4, was it, or 6 3/4? It's one of those things where we want to say that we're going in the right direction, but the reality is, if you're on the road going the wrong way, slowing down doesn't make you get going the right way. You're just slowing down. So we need to turn around and head back the right way. So any sort of a fee that takes money from the franchise or from the water fund for something that is not specifically and directly attributable to the water, I think is wrong. And renting back property and calling it a cost, it is not a cost, it's a fabrication. I cannot support fabrication like that. If you want to talk about electrical costs for the water, to pump it, to move it, to keep the lights on at City Hall in the cubicles where people who are doing water work, okay, put a separate electrical meter on it. We'll figure out what that is, and that's appropriate. We can build that. But City Hall was built. Okay, that was built already with the general fund, and it's there to house all of the departments of the city. It'd be like having the fire department pay rent back for all of their fire stations. We're not asking for that. And yet, if we looked at highest and best use, of course, in that area, it'd probably be houses or office buildings, probably not a fire station. So there's a lot of flaws, I think, in the logic behind this. I'm very discouraged that it really doesn't address what I think are the costs. And I think the only way we can get to what the costs are is through an actual audit. I do make a motion for an audit by a CPA.
We're gonna hold back on motions for right now, but I appreciate your comment.
It's out there.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
Second.
Mr. Alcantara, I wanted to talk to Mr. Ortega.
Well, I just want to be cautious, well, a couple of acknowledgements just in terms of the work of this committee and the work of the in coordination with the city. It looks like we're on the cutting edge of this type of issue, and so I want to be cautious in recognizing the city's commitment to provide the information, and I anticipate there's a lot more questions to ask, some of them philosophical, as Mr. Williams has pointed out, and I anticipate our ad hoc committee continuing to serve together for a while, but we're kind of forerunners in a lot of these types of issues. So the one thing I also want to really cautious this group on is the purpose, from my perspective, of the in lieu franchise fee was kind of a convenience charge. Let's just set it at 10%. Let's, you know, that's about probably what it's going to cost. We poked at it and we realized 10% is way too high. I want to be cautious not going too far down the line where we all of a sudden have this huge infrastructure of accounting for every penny and it's costing us more than that 10% to get to what that actual fee is. I think there's a balance somewhere in the middle. So I look forward to continuing the discussion. I think there's a lot more information to get, but I do want to encourage us to be cautious in that.
Mr. Ortega.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think there's several key elements here that are not philosophical. One of them has to do with establishing the highest and best use of some of these facilities that are being charged to the waterfront. And while I agree that office space and all of that may warrant some chargeback, I do have an issue with rent that's being paid for land that houses dedicated facilities. Unless, you know, we're abiding by standard utility industry practices where you are charging a utility rate based on utility appraisals and utility type easements for those facilities. And I was an assistant general manager of 2 water districts, and when we were negotiating with cities for our rights of way, that's how we negotiated those facilities. Secondly, I think that everybody's concerned about deviations from cost of service. One example, and for those of you that are in real estate, maybe you can educate me about this. In page 5 of 17 in the appendix of the report, there's a market rent rate at 8%, for example, and this is the calculation that's used to see what percentage of the value of the property can be charged as rent. I called around to folks in the utility sector that are negotiating easements, and they said that even when you're getting into areas that are high market value, you're not getting 8% right now. And so this is one of the things that I hope that we would annually evaluate in evaluating the cost of service. And if the market is down and real estate prices are down and the rent to value ratio is lower, then that's what ought to be charged. And I understand right now the percentage that's going is typically about half of that, about 4%. In an up economy, I understand that it could be anywhere from 7 to 11%. But I don't want to get into the weeds with that. I just think that those are the kind of discussions that we would be having, not, as Mr. Seaborn observed, where you have a certain rate and then you have an escalator that jumps from that, regardless of what the market conditions might be for these rents. Thank you.
Mr. Seaborn.
I'll be brief, I promise. Just as a reminder, the original purpose of the franchise fee was to cover the assumed costs, and they were never nailed down. It's just assumed that 10% of the revenue of the water sales would cover the administrative costs associated with the city clerk's office, city manager's office, and those specific department heads and those people when it comes to water issues. And when you look at the way it was written, it looks like You know, it covers council time and meeting time for the clerk and for the city manager to work out budgeting and those sorts of issues with department heads. You know, we went from an administrative cost, which we now found out has been billed twice in the form of an in lieu franchise fee, and then on top of that, the administrative costs and city manager costs billing back to the to this particular fund. So it is getting double taxed, if you will. And you know, here we are, and are we making progress? And I think we are. But again, it's one of those things where if you're going the wrong direction, it's not going to work.
Appreciate your feedback on that. I'd like to make one more comment about just a question of asking for an audit. While you're going to get perhaps more accurate numbers, it's also a possibility that you're going to get higher numbers if you use the same functional interpretation of how each one of these allocations should be made.
The truth will set you free.
Great. I'm saying it could be more than 10% that we're looking at down the road, Greg. And if that's the case, I'm just saying be aware of be careful of what you ask for.
But we're asking for an audit, not a justification to continually pull money out of the water.
Well, that's a philosophical opinion. That's not a fact.
No, it's a fact.
I'm just saying what you said. There's no necessary justification back or forth. What they did, as I understand it, is simply look at the issues, see whether or not the 10% was adequate based upon certain assumptions. If we want to go further into that, we certainly can ask council to make recommendations to that effect. And whatever we say here, council is ultimately going to have to make a decision on what direction council wants to go for this city, and that's why we elected them, for better or for worse. And so I'm just saying that's their role, and this discussion is positive in that regard.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir.
I don't think it is philosophical, because I think that when the city staff provides the documents that are issued for a report, and the city staff requests the appraisal, that the appraisals be based on market rates rather than utility appraisals, which are industry standard, there's a big difference, and I think a CPA firm would know the difference. So I don't think it's a toss-up. I think that the truth will set you free, but I think it's also going to be done in a manner that meets basic accounting standards and rigor in order to come up with the final number. So at least we can trust it.
Yeah, and perhaps I was using the word philosophical in a manner which I have a tendency to use it, and that, we can get the facts, and that's a good thing, but what meaning we assign to those facts is oftentimes a different question, so that's all. Mr. Rivera, I think you haven't spoken in a while, and I'll get back to you, Mr. Dean.
Well, I'm a property owner. I've lived here for almost 35 years. If we ask for an audit, when we get that, and if you just said, well, maybe it won't go the way you want it, the people would rather see a truthful audit. And then they would say, hey, if it's 11%, it's 11%. Because right now, my feeling is, along with people in my neighborhood, that the city has lied to them. Okay, I'm just saying what is being said out there. So if you go along and you say, well, we don't need, I'm not saying you said this, we don't need that audit, how is that going to change Joe Public out there from thinking, well, wait a minute, you said 10%, I read in the newspaper where it should have been 6.7 or whatever it was, Joe Public's going to go, wait a minute, this isn't right, I'm getting screwed, excuse me. But if we do a real audit where we have some facts and figures, I think the average person's got enough brains to go, if it's costing that much to fix something and take care of something and make water good and safe and clean, they're not going to argue.
Okay, Mr. Dean.
Yeah, I would say that this is indeed more than a philosophical discussion. I'm looking at it specifically from a legal perspective, and that's what I think, while the idea of an audit I think is good, I think probably before we launch into it, we should get a legal opinion as to what can and can't be done. Again, Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association is basically the keeper of Prop 218, and they obviously won the...
I would disagree. I said the people of the state of California are the keepers of that.
The only
that's just another opinion.
Well, I would have to say that the only organization that actually goes to court to protect the taxpayers under Prop 218 is Howard Jarvis, okay? And they won the Fresno case and they won the Roseville case, and that's what this whole discussion is based on, is the findings in those cases. So I would like to get their opinion, their legal director's opinion, as to whether or not what is being proposed in this study it meets legal muster, and I think that's really critical before we even spend the time evaluating property values and all that, because it may be that depending on their findings that the property leaseback arrangement is just not appropriate. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Otto, haven't heard from you tonight.
You know, we've been spending a lot of time discussing the water fund to general fund transfer, and I'm in total agreement that I like the direction it's going, and that it would behoove us to have it supported by an independent audit. But when are we going to spend some time with the potential options here of providing suitable restitution for the excess charges that are addressed in this memorandum that was sent with the water study?
Earlier on, when we brought the question of the comments from the committee members based upon the first part of the talk or the presentation tonight, we sort of stopped the presentation at that point, and we held off on the next phase of what potential recommendations were being offered, and we could certainly bring that forward at this point and continue the presentation at this point. Would you be willing to go forward with that right now, Dave, or do you guys have another perspective you'd like to? And there are several ways we can go. This committee, for instance, could open it up to discussion from the public at this particular point. We could ask for a continuance of this particular meeting for another 2 weeks, as was suggested by Mr. Dean and Mr. C. Time out. We'll get to you. I'm just looking at some other options that we could have, so that, because there was a question of whether or not we had enough time to really do the kind of evaluative work that we might want. Mr. Ortega?
Mr. Chairman, I think that there were motions that were suggested earlier by Mr. Dean, Mr. Seaborn, Mr. DeCoeur, that could preclude the second part of the conversation. There is, I think we've had ample discussion about, some of the nuts and bolts of the report, and so I think whether we proceed should be contingent upon whether any of these motions are going to move, and whether these motions could be altered or changed by the facts presented in the next part of the presentation, or whether there's any use in proceeding with the next part of the presentation, given where we're at this point.
Mr. Jordan? Excuse me, Mr. Seaborn, you did have a real quick comment you wanted to make.
Just a point of order, I believe we do need to take public comments. I mean, it's not something we can defer to a different day.
That's going to be my suggestion before we muddy the waters with the next part of the subject. I would like to hear from the public. So.
In fact, I look forward to hearing. As chair, right now what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring the discussion back to the chair and open up the discussion to members of the public. How many, time out for just 1 second. There is a speaker's request form that was over on the table. Those of you that have those, would you like to give them to Chad?
Real quick, hold on to them, sorry. Hold on to it. You can give it to me after you speak, but if you could fill them out, it does help with our meeting minutes. So
Just
that's
sort
great.
of take your, either form a line or do something, maybe people that want to speak in the front row and then the second row and so on, just to make it easy. I'd also like to remind everybody to please make sure that your comments are based upon the issues that we have heard that are appearing on the agenda, if you might, and each person has 3 minutes.
Yeah, just a reminder. You can hear okay? Yeah, just a reminder, you get 3 minutes.
Please identify yourself by name, and that would help.
So if you could, identify yourself by name, you'll have 3 minutes. The lights here will tell you when you have 30 seconds, when it comes yellow, when it comes red. If you could, finish up your comments, that would be great. Afterwards, if you can hand me your card, you don't have to fill it out, it just helps us give a good detailed meeting minutes afterwards, okay?
Barry Levinson. I rushed here from a wedding in Redlands because I thought it was that important to hear what was going to happen at this meeting and to be able to express my opinions. I have 3 quick things I'd like to say. In looking at what has been presented and what I saw online quickly, because we'd only had 4 days to look at it, I noticed a couple of things. Number one, the background information given today stated that this proposition passed in 1996. It took the city apparently 16 years to realize that the citizens of this city apparently have been overcharged for 16 years since the time when it said that you had to figure out exactly what the cost is and no more. Since the city apparently didn't do any studies, and apparently the city wasn't concerned about that potential issue. Number 2, I'm looking at which has not been discussed here, but it's definitely part of this whole presentation, the summary appraisal report. Summary appraisal report has a page and it has assumptions and conditions. And then it has one that says extraordinary assumptions and hypothetical conditions, which caught my eye. As somebody with an auditing and accounting background, extraordinary has a very specific meaning. But basically it talks about the fact that you're going to use the highest and best use of each site for land valuation purposes. And it's based on assumed appropriate zoning and general plan designations, similar to or compatible with surrounding properties. I don't understand why you would take something zoned for something else, the water usage, the reservoir, and then look at the rates, the valuation of property for residential usage. It's not comparing apples to apples. These reservoirs, number one, are not being used for residential. They're not planned to be used for residential. So why are we using that? That to me, I think, needs an explanation. The third thing I'd like to say real quickly, and that revolves around the allocation methodology itself. For an allocation to come up with a fair and honest number, you have to do a couple of things. Number one, you have to have common sense reasons why you're allocating something. What is the basis for this allocation? And number two, it has to be done consistently. The gentleman here, when asked the question about other enterprise funds within the city, said they haven't even looked at it. So they've admitted that they didn't even look at the consistency with the city. So right then and there, that makes this study suspect. And I certainly agree with Mr. Dean and Mr. Seaborn and Mr. Ortega that we need to look at this more closely and not make a vote tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Levinson.
Hi, my name is Matthew Rowe. I'm also running for City Council in this recall election. I'd like to echo some of the comments that were made earlier, and some of the similar comments to Mr. Levinson's. Number one, in any engineering or math problem I've ever done, you usually start out your problem with laying out your formula, your methodology for how you're going to do your calculations. And I think Mr. Ortega raised a very good point. You know, what kind of accepted practices do we use to conduct or to determine what percentage of the city's street maintenance is attributable to water, did we look at he asked if we looked at the American Society of Civil Engineers and what their practices would be. Well, I'd like to see a comparison or at least some data formulating, how percentages were calculated, what other methods are used, and then a rationale, a summary listing in an argumentative form why this particular approach was taken to determine. It looked like there was an assumption of 33% of street maintenance was attributable to the city's water lines. That seems like a pretty hand-picked number. It doesn't seem grounded in any specific rigorous calculation method. Second, what I think I heard the Director of Engineering for the city say is that the water lines are repaired when there's a leak. That would seem to preclude the idea that there's actual preventive maintenance done on the city's water services. Now, I deal with a lot of manufacturing companies in my current job, and even when I was in the Army, we do preventive maintenance on vehicles. You notice that it's a lot more expensive to fix something after it's broken than actually allocating money year after year to go in toward preventative maintenance. So add that on to the fact that we're calculating these costs as a percentage of maintenance fees, a percentage of maintenance costs. So the higher it costs to maintain something, the more the city gets to charge the water fund for it. That doesn't seem to be very responsible. The third thing is, echoing Mr. Levinson's last point, about market rate versus either utility rates that are being used or the actual direct costs that we can attribute in the city budget. The lady in the green jacket earlier was saying that, well, the water fund is an enterprise fund that has to stand on its own. It has to support itself. So these facilities, which should be billed in terms of the direct proportion of square footage that's being used actually for water, not the entire facility acreage, but how much of that cost is attributed to the use of, or how much of that cost is attributable to actual maintenance of the facility? You'd have to do is look at the city's expenditures when it comes, here for street maintenance, they calculate labor, materials, and equipment. But we don't do that for the water facilities. We use market rate property rates. That seems inconsistent. If we were using labor, materials, and equipment to calculate what we spend on fixing the city's streets, then we should do that for these facilities that the city's supposedly spending money from the general fund to maintain, not market rate prices.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Erin Lewis, and I just want to say thank you to the Ad-Hoc committee, especially some of the members that do recognize that the city given 7 months to put together a report like this, and then them asking you for 4 days of review and to maybe vote on it is kind of just baffling to me. Also, I did catch something. I just want to understand that, do we only hot patch residential, city streets and not residential? Because I see that a lot of people do have problems in their residential streets with pipes breaking and just doing a cold patch and never coming back. And we've got these 56,000-pound trucks, three of them a day or once a week, come through our streets and destroy them. And so transparency, goodness gracious me. City of Fullerton has been doing this for several years, and it's about time, and I'm so glad to see that this ad hoc committee is here. And I know we have a lot of diversity here with opinions. A lot of people are for this and against it, and I really want to say that it's good to know that we have such a diverse crowd here on the ad hoc committee paying attention to everything, and I just want to give you all kudos for what you're doing here, because I myself have been a resident since 1987, been paying attention in the background but not in the city, coming to the city council meetings, and now I'm doing it. And I'm very enlightened to the things that our city council and our city get away with people who do not come to these meetings and pay attention. And I think that we definitely need to get people more involved in this city in regards to what our city is screwing us for.
Hi, Michelle Carney, resident of Fullerton. I guess I have a couple of questions. Is it industry standard, the lady in the green, I'm sorry,
is it industry standards? The other cities, they charge rent for their own city property? Is that industry standard, or is that something that you're using from the Jarvis Fresno thing? Because that obviously didn't work out. So are you using that kind of, because I keep hearing you say it's a good concept, and I guess what I'm really hearing from you, it's a legal concept, that maybe not, it's a really ethical or transparent one. And let's be frank here, I've traveled the world, I've seen water sources that were just absolutely horrible. We are extremely lucky here in the United States to even have running water. I talked to this gentleman last time, and I have done some research on water and just how really important it is. So, and I know that some people think it's a philosophical thing, and I look at it this way: if the city has been taking money from me, which I assume is for infrastructure, which, what is there, 400 years that we need to work on, that I assume that they're doing for that, and they're spending it on other things. I mean, that, you know, if we're asking for an independent review, and I don't know what, when Joe Fells gets the receipt, I'm not really sure how independent it is. And so with the independent audit, I would just make sure, Mr. Fells, that it is somebody that, you know, because I mean, just look at what we paid for. We paid $60,000 for these guys to come up with a report with actually no facts and figures. And then Best and Krieger came in to evaluate, which I assume they're defending against the Jarvis people that asked City Council since December 10th to actually address this situation, which they haven't. Because there's totally two different things, philosophical and then there's political. And when you guys say that the truth will set you free, not necessarily. Some people go to jail for that, just so you know. And I guess my very big concern is, okay, so we get this independent review, and then you take it to the fund board people who are actually, you know, on the water board as well. I mean, really, how transparent can that be? And it just concerns me that, you know, these guys have volunteered, give it, unbelievable, you guys rule. You guys have volunteered your time, given the city something, it has taken them months to give you guys a report, then you guys are given 3 days to vote on something, or even put your input on something, because you guys are the experts. Whether I agree or disagree, you guys are the expert. And if you guys are saying not to make a vote, please do not vote on it today, you know, and really listen to what some of these, what you guys have to say, and don't vote on it, because if you do, it's just gonna be mayhem in city council, I'll tell you right now.
Thank you. Excuse me. The other one wasn't working.
Good evening, Ad-Hoc, Jane Rand.
Hi, Jane.
One of the issues that wasn't discussed yet, that I would like also added to any future discussion is the benefits, the financial benefits to the city when there are water improvements, when they do repiping projects and such, like the one they did on Wilshire last year. And then as part of that water project, they end up repaving the street. Do they get credit for that, dollar amount credit? Likewise, I'm assuming when they put in a reservoir in a city-owned property, like a park, any improvements that the Water Enterprise Fund puts in, that they get credit for that, and maybe even rent back that benefit to the city. It's sort of along the lines of what Mr. George was discussing. Regarding the 4 options for restitution, I'm glad that the committee is not considering, or it sounds like they're not considering discussing that tonight, because it would not be appropriate, because based on the assumptions that the report is as correct as the independent audit that you are now asking for. And one of the questions that came up earlier, there was some discrepancy as to the cost of the studies that have been done, and it sounded like there was clarification from $100,000 to $60,000 for just this one 7-month report. However, this process began, I believe it was March 11th was the first public meeting in City Hall last year, prior to the creation of the Ad-Hoc committee. There were reports already being created by, I recall this same consultant being there. I would like to know that number, the cost in total since last year for all the reports and all the work that they have been doing, because unfortunately it seems as though there's been a lot of runaround, and fortunately for us, the citizens of the city, this ad hoc committee has been digging in and asking for information, but in the meantime, we've been getting a runaround and sort of wasting money that could have gone to an audit that could have been done right off the bat. I feel like we're just squandering more of our money in that sense. Thank you.
Good evening.
Hi, I'm Doug Chafee. I'd like to thank Mr. McNally for conducting this meeting with so many different philosophies. I know you said you're not running for council. Perhaps you should be. I heard a lot of remarks this evening, and I would identify most closely with those of Mr. Williams, because I couldn't come close to being as articulate as he did. I won't try to repeat that. I think there's several things that might be helpful as you go forward. One, I had hoped to have a copy of Proposition 218, but it was not attached here. Perhaps the attorney might provide that, along with a summary of the cases that have tried to interpret Proposition 218, so we can all have a better understanding of just what that is. I also find the concept of an enterprise fund or enterprise entity to be confusing. It seems to be neither fish nor fowl. It's part of the city, but it isn't. So wouldn't it be appropriate to have someone who could come in and sort of nail that down so we could all come to some common understanding as to how that works? I'm confused. I'd like to have more clear answers to that. And then I found some interesting things when I read through the report, and I've only just looked at it this evening. The appraisal of the property values, for example, the Hillcrest property, did not seem to include the value of the reservoirs. It seemed to be of land only. And then, so I have a question. Who owns a reservoir? Is it the same as a landowner, or is that different? And who's responsible for it? And I know that reservoir in particular was recently renovated, and I wonder what the cost of that was. It struck me, as in my memory, as being more than the cost of the appraised land value. And I don't know where that's accounted for. You don't have a water system without reservoirs, so where is that accounted for in all of this costing stuff? And I agree that it would be good to come to some common understanding as to what costs should come into this, so that we can evolve, I hope, from a franchise fee to a true costing system, so that it's fair and responsible, and we have transparency in what's going on. It's vitally important that the citizens truly understand what the cost really is, and get away from conflicting information. So I commend you to your work. Move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Rick Alvarez here. I want to thank you first, all of you folks, to participate and volunteer your time and your thoughts. And wanted to ask a couple questions. The first one was, how come is it we can only go back 3 years? Is there a statute of limitation on that or something, which I'm not aware of?
Yes, there is.
Great. This study has already cost us $60,000, and folks that know me, I'm a real cost guy. So one of the things is, why can't we save some dollars going forward in this audit that was now being asked for by Sharon and others? If the numbers come, Joe, from the city staff, it's given to an auditor, correct? It's not an internal account, correct? Right? So the reason why we're calling for an independent audit is because there's very little trust, perhaps, or they don't feel like there's a transparency factor there with the staff, right? My issue is, why can't we get it to that point where we can have that confidence, where we can have that transparency with these folks that are sitting here as a part of the committee, and then we don't have to go out and spend money for things which we don't have in-house, like an independent appraisal officer who can appraise these properties properly the way they should be done. And that way we would reduce the cost of the actual audit by just having to go out of house for things that we cannot do within our house. Anyway, that's one of my thoughts. Last one was, about 2 meetings ago, we talked about meters. And we talked, I think, Dave, right? You talked about some digital meters going in. And I thought that they were going in as a test for evaluation and what have you. I've had some people come up to me and say, no, I've had this meter slammed on my property, and now I'm part of this digital meter age. So is the evaluation period over? Are we moving forward with that? Is that another way to justify increasing cost to the consumers? Where are we at with that? Can we get answers? Just comments.
Real quick, could you just say, Dave, just on that one issue?
Yeah, sorry, but I believe you're referring to our pilot program on our automatic meter reading. Yeah, we have about, right now, 50 meters in the system that we put the automated meters on, and we're just testing them out. From a customer perspective, they get their bill just like any other time. We hand read those meters still and process it through our utility billing system. We have them in there now because we're looking at the signal that comes back into City Hall and to see how it works. And we're kind of evaluating their use, but it's really of no impact or no cost. The two pilot companies that came in, absolutely no cost to the city. Actually, they gave us 50 meters that we were going to change out, so that's no cost to us.
So going forward, it's going to be a no cost.
No, if once the pilot will not cost us anything, and we'll have that data to present to City Council if they wanted to do that project, which is part of this infrastructure.
All right, so it's,
Yeah, I think, yeah.
So it's going to become a City Council decision whether we move forward with digital meters throughout the city.
That is correct.
Yeah, that's a good one. Thank you. Thank you for your time. I was going to ask anybody else would like to come forward, please do so.
Okay. Thank you. My name is Tony Package, and I'm a resident of Fullerton. My question is more clarification. On page 9, we have all these properties that analysis of rental payment for use of city property. And my question is, are the city properties used by the water fund have other uses? And so is the value of those other uses subtracted from the value of the property to determine what actual rent should be? That's it. Thank you.
Okay, we can make sure we try to address that issue down the road. And like the other questions that came forward, we didn't engage in the dialogue, which is for general questions for the public. And by the way, I'd like to thank every member of the public that took your time out on this Monday evening to come here. It shows same kind of dedication that a lot of us have to come and do that, because this is something that we all volunteered to do. All right, I'm going to bring the meeting back to the chair then, and I would like to get a consensus from the committee at this particular point, what direction the committee would like to head at this time, where we are in relationship to going any further with looking at the recommendations page we were given earlier, which is on the back or the last page of the handout, or if any would be appropriate tonight to move forward with any kind of recommendations or motions, or just giving some thoughts that have come to mind during the meeting. We would like to schedule another gathering, maybe let's say in 2 weeks, for this committee to meet after we've had a little bit more time to go over these questions, and then move forward with any kind of further recommendations that we might want to do. So these are some things that are options that we have right now, and I'd like to start with Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Some of the comments from the public are certainly applicable to what I was thinking and feeling. Somebody mentioned earlier best practices. I think that would be something that would be useful as we sort of form a basis for recommendation. I think the idea of this whole enterprise fund, I think we should delve into that with a little more detail. I 4 years on the council and 1 year as mayor, and I'm learning stuff here that I expected I would have known. So I'd like to have that information personally myself before I'd like to go forward. So there's just some of those things that are floating out there that would be, I think, best brought back for some further discussion. So best practices. And also, the other thing that I don't see in the report is assumptions. And that's part and parcel to a lot of reports. President of the Fox, we just did a big study. Assumptions was the first couple pages. So that would be helpful too.
Mr. Dean, did you have your?
Yeah, I'd like to make a motion that we postpone doing anything on this and reconvene in 2 weeks. That would be, I think, probably a good time to do that. And that would allow us the opportunity to ask more questions of staff and perhaps the people who did the study. As I think I mentioned earlier, if there's some mechanism we could use, maybe an email address or two that we could use to to inquire when we come up with a question, that would be great. But whatever you think is appropriate. So that would be my motion. 2 weeks.
Okay, there. Second.
Second.
Okay, formal motion on the floor right now?
Second.
Okay. Second. Any discussion on the motion?
One of my concerns. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Elaine Mitchell, we haven't heard from you tonight. Hi, good to see you.
Well, it's just a cautionary note. Does 2 weeks give us enough time to put out the public notice that we need to do before we
need 3 days. We need 3 days to give a public notice.
Yeah.
For
a meeting.
Okay, that's fine.
I think, am I not mistaken?
Correct.
And the same way that this meeting fell within those same guidelines?
Yes, yeah, okay. And, yeah, that's it for now. I just wanted to make sure.
Okay, we have a motion on the floor in a second. The motion basically is to postpone any further discussion or further motions until such time as we can have a little bit more time to look this over. And at that particular time, well, first we'd have to decide on, moving forward. The second would be agenda. And I think that the committee would like, and I'd like to make sure that the committee has some kind of input into that. So we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion on that? Mr. Williams.
A question, what is the availability of staff and the people who are presenting us reports before we make that decision? Can we do a quick poll on that with staff?
Yeah, I think that's an appropriate question, and I think we don't want to step on their toes, but how do things look for you guys over there?
I'm here every day.
Right.
No, we check as before, we will contact each one of you, try to get a time that works best for the group. We can make sure that our consultants are available based on your wishes. And, the time, it might be 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks, or...
Yeah, we usually get that from...
we'll try to coordinate as we usually do.
Becky is the staff coordinator for that, and maybe she would be the appropriate person to communicate with. And she might also be the appropriate person to communicate with regarding questions that the committee wanted to address so that those could be brought. I'm just saying as a...
Yeah, we could get those questions and field them to the right people and get those answers. If that's the way you guys wish.
I think it's in the best interest of the committee and the public that you don't answer the individual questions with the individual commissioners. Bring the questions to the committee and then answer them there. I think that's the best way to disseminate the information.
That's better protocol, because if it's just one-on-one kind of communications, we don't want to start getting everybody on an email list and get into questions about the Browning, because in effect, large email list issues can be construed as Brown Act issues in relationship to meetings and other kinds of communications. So that's a good idea. And I would also caution members, particularly just don't hit reply all when you get an email. Everybody doesn't know what your particular questions or issues are regarding meeting times or things like that. It's just simpler. It clogs up my email. I've gotten several of those, and I just delete them right away because. But that's appropriate. We do have we have a motion on the floor with a second to go ahead. Do you, on any?
No, I just said we trust you with the details, so I call the question.
Call the question, okay.
Could we add in there that it will be an evening meeting? I think it's a lot easier for members of the public to come.
I would hope that we
So I
could
think we
work
need to
a convening
specify that.
a meeting somewhere around the 6 o'clock hour again, if that's convenient for. I think it is convenient for members of the public as opposed to holding something at 4 in the morning. Okay, question is on the floor, and all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Hearing none. Then, go ahead, Dave.
I'm sorry, Chair, we just want to, I just want to be clear of what we're bringing back in 2 weeks' time. You guys are going to filter some questions through us, we're going to prepare answers to those questions, and then
Yeah,
further discussion on the study.
I think one of our members did briefly talk, although I'm going to speak for what I heard, something dealing with the question of not franchise, excuse me, enterprise funds specifically, and how that sort of, a little bit maybe origin history, Destiny, of what those are. What enterprise funds we have in the city. I know the sewer fund and the water fund specifically. Was there some
Airport.
Oh, the airport is I don't know if it's an enterprise fund. Yeah, okay, yeah.
And also the governance of the enterprise fund.
Yeah, whether or not specifically, let's say, the water fund or the water department falls into the same purview, for instance, as like the sanitation district or the water board or something. The question of, the city council sitting basically as the representatives of that. We do have Energy and Resource Management Committee. We have the Infrastructure Review Committee. They serve as advisory bodies regarding those issues already within the city council, and we could certainly discuss opening up some more discussions within those committees, one of which I chair, to look at how whether or not we want to ask for more input into those committees regarding some of these questions. I mean, we already have some established bodies within the city advisory or community advisory bodies, which could work with the city and not necessarily go to another layer. Of course, the city committees do whatever they want to in terms of establishing committee. Okay, before put you question.
No, you had indicated a motion on the 10% diversion of funds to the general fund, putting a halt to those.
I'm going to pass on that.
I'll make a motion.
I'll second. We have a motion.
Whoa. We have a motion which has been approved to continue to 2 weeks. The next item on the agenda would be adjournment, unless there's any other issues.
I just made a motion and it was seconded.
Motion. The motion, I think the motion to continue in 2 weeks would preclude any further.
That's specifically with the rest of the agenda that says about the disbursement of the $2.5 million funds in the option. That portion was tabled, along with further discussion about this study. And in the interim, the motion that I'm making, which you had initially brought up and have decided not to, is to recommend that the council not continue with the franchise fee until we have a clear understanding of all the costs that are correctly and appropriately attributable to the water fund.
Mr. Chair, it's not on the agenda.
I think that's out of order.
It's not on the agenda.
Yeah, I think it's out of order. It's really a question I would like to see brought up, if you'd like to, in meeting 2 weeks from now. And I don't think that the delay between now and 2 weeks is going to make that much of a difference.
Sure, what's agenda is that?
So we'll put that on the agenda for the next meeting, and I appreciate your comments. But as far as I'm concerned right now, this meeting is adjourned.
Bye-bye.